Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us for part one of a two-part series on student loan debt, sponsored by Wells Fargo. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action and your host for the day. And on behalf of Consumer Action's Executive Director, Anna Flores, and the entire staff at Consumer Action, welcome. I am so excited. I am pumped about the conversation that we are about to have on student loan debt. Debt that's now the second largest slice of household debt after mortgages, bigger than credit card debt. About 42 million Americans, 1 in 8, have student loan debt. So this is a potent issue, especially for young adults like Generation Z. It's also an important issue for employers. I ran across a study conducted by the California nonprofit, and that study found that over 23% of nonprofit employees are stuck with student loan debt. This is causing nonprofits to struggle to keep and recruit employees. So it's an important issue, and that's why we are discussing it today. So, a question for you. We often think that a college degree will open doors to opportunity regardless of one's background or upbringing. So, does a college degree actually level the playing field? Is it the silver bullet for eradicating inequality? Tell me this. Is a college education still a good investment today? And if so, does it matter if my degree is in social work or engineering? And if I decide to get that 4 year degree in social work, would it be just as valuable if I decide to live in California, New York, Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia? What if I wanted to major in philosophy? Will I get a return on my investment? Or is student loan debt actually contributing to the wealth divide? And if it is contributing to the wealth divide, how? And how can we fix it? Can it be fixed? We have four experts with us today to answer those questions and more. So get ready. Dr. Anna Kent is here. She is with the Institute for Economic Equity with the Federal Reserve Bank. Dr. Kent has co authored a study on gender and racial disparities in student loan debt. But one of her primary research interests is exploring wealth outcomes and inequality. Dr. Nicole Smith is here. Dr. Smith is with the Center on Education and Workforce at Georgetown University. Listen to this. She's developed a framework for restructuring long-term occupational and educational projections. This framework allows her to project education demands for occupation in the U.S. economy through 2030. So you think she may be the one to talk about the economic value of a major? Amy Czulada and Katherine Welbeck are here. Both are student loan experts with the Student Protection Center. Amy is a seasoned labor researcher, writer, and organizer. She is the outreach and advocacy manager at SBPC. Now, the materials that you're going to receive tomorrow will be a link to one of Amy's presentation on preparing older Americans with student loans to restart repayment. When you get those materials, click on that link. Her presentation is just awesome. Katherine Welbeck is the Director of Advocacy, and she's a Civil Rights Counsel at SBPC, where she tackles racial equity and student loan debt. Now, the materials that I just mentioned that you will receive tomorrow would be a link to a new study attributed to Katherine, which looks at student loan debt in the South. I read the article on it. It is great. You'll hear a little more about that from Katherine later on in the presentation. Did I say we're bringing the fire today? We are bringing the fire today, y'all. So sit back, take a last sip of that coffee, get ready to take some notes because you're going to need to share this hot information with somebody. Now, before I get too excited, I need to go over a few housekeeping items and update you on what's happening at Consumer Action. Now, this is a 90-minute webinar. If you have any questions for our guest speakers, and I'm assuming you're going to have a ton, please use that chat box at the end of all presentations. My coworker, Nelson Santiago, is going to facilitate a question and answer segment. This is where we get to hear from you. So let's keep the conversation moving with your questions. The webinar is being recorded and it will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel. You will receive a link to the recording and all handouts by tomorrow afternoon, and that includes those studies I just mentioned in the link to the presentation by Amy. AFC professionals, you will receive the password to claim your 1.5 CEUs tomorrow as well. Now, at the end of today's webinar, you're going to receive a survey regarding today's session. Please complete the survey and return it to us as soon as possible. In addition, as a bonus for attending today, you will receive a certificate of completion. Consumer Action is presenting this webinar with funding from Wells Fargo. So a very special thanks and shout out to Wells Fargo for supporting Consumer Action and believing in our mission. Now, for those of you who are new to Consumer Action and are wondering, what do? We are an educational and advocacy organization. What do we do? As displayed right there on the screen, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong rights and policies that promote fairness for all consumers, especially underrepresented consumers nationwide. Now, when you're on our homepage, you see that little burgundy link in the middle? If you click on that button, you will land on our COVID-19 educational project page. There, you're going to find a ton of relevant, easy to use resources and tools for the communities that you serve. So now let me go over the roadmap so you know where we're headed today. We open each and every training, whether it's virtual, in person, with the game, How Much Do You Know? Today we have 3 true or false questions. After the game, I will introduce you to our guest speakers. The question and answer segment led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back, tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, and wrap up. So let's move forward with the game. This is how the game is played. There are 3 true or false questions. First, I will read the question. You will use the chat box to answer the question. Then I will close the poll and take a look at the results. I will tell you if the statement is true or false and why. And the person with the most correct answers, drum roll please, he or she will receive the bragging rights to How Much Do You Know? So let's roll out that first question. Okay, true or false? Women are more likely than men to have student debt. Is that true or is that false? Women are more likely than men to have student debt. Is that true or false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. "79% of you think that's a true statement. 21% thinks it's false." Well, actually, that's a true statement. According to gender and disparity studies, up to a study on gender and disparities in student loan debt that was published in 2022 by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. You will hear more about disparities in debt from Dr. Anna Kent during her presentation, but that is true. You're doing great. Let's move on to the next question. The average wages of college-educated workers aged 25 to 59 varies from 45,000 to 83,000 depending on their major. 45,000 and I have a college degree? Is that true or is that false? The average wages of college-educated workers aged 25 to 59 varies from 45,000 to 83,000 depending on their major. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow. 83% believe this is a true statement. 17% says it's false. 17%, I'm sorry, you're wrong. That is a true statement, according to a study conducted by Georgetown University CEU, which looked at the economic value of college majors. You will hear a little more about the study and the topic from our guest speaker, Dr. Nicole Smith, during her presentation. But you're doing great. Okay, let's move on to the last question. The learn now, pay later financing option offered by some schools is a great way for students to finance their education. Is that true or is that false? The learn now, pay later financing option offered by some schools is a great way for students to finance their education. Is that true or false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll. Oh, wow. 39% think that's a true statement. 61% says, that statement is false. Well, 61%, you're correct. According to an investigation led by the SVPC, that statement is false. You'll learn a little bit more about the investigation from our guest speakers, Amy and Katherine, a little later on in the presentation. Thank you for participating. Thank you for playing the game. If you're interested in those questions, just email me and I will send them over to you. Now, let me introduce to you our guest speakers, and they have been introduced in the order they're going to present. Dr. Ana Hernández Kent is a senior researcher for IEE at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. She conducts research, performs data analysis, and advises on issues of economic equity. Her primary research includes examining economic disparities and opportunities through a demographic lens, exploring wealth outcomes and wealth inequality, highlighting the role of systematic bias and historic factors in facilitating or blocking wealth accumulation. Dr. Kent received her PhD in experimental psychology with concentrations in social psychology and quantitative methods in behavioral science from St. Louis University. She earned a master's degree in experimental psychology from St. Louis University and a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Kent. Dr. Nicole Smith, let me introduce her to you. She is a research professor and chief economist at Georgetown University, CEW. Dr. Smith has developed a framework for restructuring long-term occupational and educational projections. This framework can be used to project education demands for occupation in the U.S. economy through 2030. Dr. Smith graduated with honors in economic and mathematics from the University of West Indies, UWI. She was the recipient of the Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Prize for Outstanding Research at the master's level at UWI and is co-recipient of the 2007 Errol Prize for Junior Economists for Education Mobility Research. She received a PhD in economics from American University in Washington, D.C. Before joining CEW, Dr. Smith was a faculty member in economics at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania and the University of West Indies. Welcome, Dr. Smith. Katherine Welbeck is the Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Counsel at the SBPC. She was previously an outreach and engagement specialist in the CFPB's Office of Public Engagement and Community Liaison. Prior to her work at the Bureau, Kat was a fourth grade teacher in Houston, Texas. Kat currently serves as a DC Program Director of Rising Leaders, Inc., a nonprofit mentoring program that empowers middle school students through high quality mentorships and leadership development training. Kat is also the Director of Engagement on the Rising Leaders Inc. Board of Directors. She holds a BA degree from Princeton University and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She's licensed to practice law in Texas. Now let me introduce you to Amy Czulada. She is an outreach and advocacy manager at SBPC. Previously, Amy was a research analyst at 32BJ SEIU, that's a union in New York City. Prior to her work at SEIU, Amy was heavily involved in research and activism around wage theft in Greater Denver area. She graduated with her master's degree in international studies from the Joseph Corbell School at the University of Denver and has a bachelor's degree in English and Spanish from LaSalle University in Philadelphia. Welcome, Amy. It's a pleasure to have you and all the speakers here. Now, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Dr. Kent. Dr. Kent, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today. I am eager to hear your presentation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you control of the mouse so you will be able to move your slides and do your presentation.
That sounds great. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Nelson, and others who had a role at Consumer Action to plan this event. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. Looks like we have a good crowd today. I am going to talk about, as Linda was saying, student debt, but also disparities, demographic disparities within student debt. Now, my primary area of research actually has to do with wealth overall, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a more high-level overview on different demographic wealth gaps, and then I'm going to dive deeper into student debt, and hopefully that'll set up my fellow panelists well when it's their turn to speak as well. So overall wealth inequality in 2022. So in the United States, as of the last quarter of 2022, this is the most recent data we have, total family wealth was about $140 trillion. Now, if we split families up by how much, where they fall in a distribution, how much wealth they have, the top 10% of families, they owned almost 7/10 of that wealth pie, or 68%. The next 40% of families owned 29%, or about 3/10. Now, if you're doing the math, about 7/10 plus about 3/10, that's about 10/10 or the whole thing, right? There's not a lot of money left over, not a lot of wealth left over for the bottom half of American families. What this means is that the bottom half of American families, they split just a 3% share of that total wealth pie. So they have very little wealth compared to families in the middle and families especially at the top. And that's the state of overall wealth inequality in the US. Now, obviously this can be thought of as problematic. This is very far from what studies show is an ideal for just your average typical person in the US, right? We think that there's a lot more equality, and we would hope that there's even more equality than we think, but that is not the case. And why this really matters is because, who is in that bottom half of American families that, again, only have 3% of the total wealth pie, that's not randomly distributed. So people and families are much more likely to be low wealth if they are a person of color, Black or Hispanic Latino, compared to white, or they're less educated. By less educated, I'm just meaning somebody with less than a 4-year college degree. They're also more likely to be in that bottom 50% if they're younger. Now, this probably kind of makes sense, right? When you're younger, you are more likely to be in an entry-level position. You haven't really had time to accumulate assets. You might be in debt as you try to build up your wealth. But not only do we find this with younger versus older, we also find it generationally at the same age. So what do I mean by that? I mean that what we find in the data is that millennials and Gen Z adults are more likely to have less wealth than older generations like baby boomers at the same ages. So it's not just about them being younger, it's actually a generational trend as well. People led by single people, our families are also more likely to be in this low wealth group, especially if they're women and especially if they're mothers. And then some recent research that I've done with a colleague, Sophia Scott, has found that LGBTQ plus groups are also more likely to be in this low wealth category. Now compare that to high wealth. Non-Hispanic whites are much more likely to be high wealth. More educated folks are more likely to be high wealth, as I said. Older American adults, that makes sense, but also generationally, baby boomers, married people. And it's not just the case that it's, for example, married wealth is about double single wealth. No, it's actually more than that. So there's something additional that marriage is either pointing to or providing in terms of wealth accumulation. Men versus women. Women without children tend to have more wealth than mothers. And then, as I said, non-LGBTQ plus identifying adults as well. But I'm mostly going to be talking about educational wealth gaps for this presentation. If you have questions on others, I'm happy to take them. But obviously this is what this webinar is focused on today. So demographics really aren't destiny, but they are strongly related to wealth outcomes. And one of the things, the common narratives that we hear frequently is that higher education is the solution to financial woes, right? And really, if you look at the right side, this graph here, you can see that, yeah, maybe if we're looking at the aggregate, if we're looking at all the data combined, there's some truth to this, right? So at the very top, I hope that's your screen is large enough for you to see the differences here. The very top, that dark blue line, that's postgraduate degree. And we can see that all of these numbers are over a 30-year period. They're adjusted for inflation, so you can compare them. We can see that their wealth has really grown. Obviously, these are different people. Some people die, some people enter this group. But if we're comparing postgrads today to postgrads back in the late 80s, there's a pretty big jump in wealth and median wealth, so wealth right in the middle. Now, their wealth for postgrad is about double that of somebody with just at most a bachelor's degree. That's the next line down, that purple line. And that wealth is over double that of somebody with an associate's degree or a high school degree. And you can see that the following two lines, the light blue and the green, those tend to track each other fairly well over time. And that's one of the reasons that we don't include the 2-year degree with the 4-year degree or higher, because there's a pretty big financial gap between those two. And finally, one thing that we've seen is that people or families with at most a GED, so a high school degree that's not on time, right, or a high school dropout, their wealth has actually shrunk pretty considerably at the median over this 30-year period. So in other words, this common narrative that higher education is the solution does seem to have some truth to it. And people are latching onto that. So back in 1989, 23% of families were headed by a 4-year college grad or higher. And in 2019, that had bumped up to 39%. So clearly many more families and individuals within those families are attaining college degrees. And this is another way to look at it. On the left side here, you see that 4-year college grads, they're only a little bit less than 40% of the household population, yet they take up 63% of total income and 77%, even bigger, of total net worth. So financially, it does seem to make sense. However, again, that's looking at things in the aggregate. So before I get to breaking it down a little bit more, I wanted to point out some demographic differences. So 38% of adults over 25 have a bachelor's degree. This differs ever so slightly from the number of households that have somebody with a bachelor's degree. A little bit more women than men. If you look generationally, there's a bigger split there with more younger women than men. And then in terms of race and ethnicity, Asians and whites are more likely to have bachelor degrees than Black and Hispanic Americans. But I think one of the more interesting findings is this kind of educational stickiness, where if you look at the bottom bullet, more than 4 in 5 adults, if both of their parents have a bachelor's degree, they also have a bachelor's degree, versus just 18% of adults have a bachelor's degree if neither parent has college experience. And I'll dive into this more in this slide here, educational stickiness slide. Basically what this is showing, the blue is the share of adults that have a 4-year college degree. And then the columns are different based on the familiarity your parents have with college. And so basically what you can see from bottom to top is that the more experience your parents have with college, the more likely it is that that adult child also has a 4-year college degree. And it's sticky on both sides. So if you look at the far right, that the white bars, the white part of the bars, which are a little bit difficult to see, If we look at the very top, only 2% of adults never attend college if both of their parents have a four-year college degree, versus half of adults if neither parent has a college experience. So what we see here is that it's very sticky, as I said, on both sides. And there are racial differences here. I didn't throw that slide in, but there are racial differences where Blacks have the lowest intergenerational college persistence. So they're the least likely to have a four-year degree if their parents do as well. It's still sticky for them, but not as much as it is for the other races and ethnicities. And on the flip side, Hispanics have the highest rate of no college persistence. So if neither of their parents have any college experience, they're the least likely to go to college out of the races and ethnicities. So all of this, Linda, I think, is going to pass out the slides later in case you're interested in looking at these statistics in more depth, because I know I'm probably going through them a little bit quickly. But all this to say is that it's sticky and on both sides, and this matters because education is really not the great equalizer. So for example, if we're looking at Black and Latino families with at most a bachelor's four-year college degree, and we compare their typical wealth at the median to white, non-Hispanic white family with at most a high school degree, their wealth is actually lower. So if we're looking at the bars, with the same color bars, we can see that as people get more education, their wealth typically increases. This makes sense, right? It goes back to this this narrative of education being worth it, this being a way to get ahead, being economically mobile, getting you know, more wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And we could see that if we're looking at the same color bars or the same races. But if we're looking across, it definitely doesn't make up for the gaps, right? And as I said, parents' education and wealth also really significantly matter. I have a couple slides in the appendix if you're interested in that bullet. And I'm happy to talk about it as well in the Q&A. But in terms of the college boost, so if we go back to the slide that was looking over that 30-year period, that line graph, and we saw that for postgrads, they had about twice what four-year college grads had, and they had more than twice of what somebody with a high school degree had. Basically, what we're saying there is college is worth it, and the college boost over time has increased. Now, this is really an important point that's pretty subtle as well. Over time, maybe the college boost has increased, but if we're looking at generations, within generations, then it's a completely different story, okay? The college boost has actually weakened. So if we're looking at the return on a college degree for income or for wealth for a 1930s born family versus a 1980s born family, the return is smaller for that 1980s born older millennial family. And we can see this for income. It's a little bit weaker. I think that you can see my cursor here, so we can see that it's held fairly steady and then dropped off a little bit for the white older millennials group. And same thing for Black. Other than the 1930s, it's been pretty steady in terms of income. But if we look at wealth, again, it's a different story. So for whites, it's gone down pretty drastically from 1930s. And this is, again, not the year of when they got their degree, but this is when they were born. So for 1930s born, they had about 247 times more wealth if they were a college graduate than a white 1930s born family without a college degree, versus just 42% more wealth for a white 1980s born four-year college graduate versus a white 1980s born non-college graduate. And we can see that for Blacks, it's even more dramatic. First of all, the drop is dramatic, and second of all, for the 1970s and 1980s Black college graduates, that difference is actually not even significant, meaning that we're not seeing a significant difference in wealth accumulation for 1970s and 1980s born Black college grads versus those that don't get a degree. And we're comparing within race here, so we're controlling for racial differences too. So basically, if we're looking at explaining why that result might be, we have to do we have to use explanations that make sense for wealth, but not for income. Because again, the income premium of college is holding fairly steady across generations, but it's not doing the same thing. The wealth premium is not doing the same thing. So the first explanation that we come to is the rising cost of higher education. And that's really critical for this webinar as well. So regardless of whether or not you have to take out student loans, the fact that higher education has risen at a much faster pace than, say, all other goods and services, that really matters here because you're paying for it or your parents are paying for it, regardless of whether or not you take out the loan. So that's going to affect your wealth overall. But we do see that also student loans have, of course, increased very considerably over time. So that matters too, especially if you have to take out those loans because of interest rates, because it might take you longer to pay those off. And so that might have a larger effect on your overall wealth later on. Sorry, there we go. We've also looked at differences in taking out student loans and balances by generation. At the same time, again, so we're controlling for age here. We're just looking at different generations. And what we can see is that Gen Zers are both more likely to take out student loans than millennials at the same age. And they also have higher balances when they do. So their average balance is higher for those that have taken out loans, and their median loan balance is higher as well. Okay, so the second potential explanation that we have is basically just that you can take out debt more easily than you could in the past. And we can see this from debt to income ratios. Pretty much for every generation over their age and over time, we can see that they're more likely to have higher debt to income ratios, meaning that it's easier for them to get maybe consumer credit. And that can play a role in explaining some of the weakness in wealth accumulation for more recent graduates. And these debt burdens require greater financial acumen today among college graduates at notably younger ages. So the risk of overextending a household's finances are much higher today than they were in the past, especially because of the prohibition, except in a few cases, on discharging student loans in bankruptcy, right? You can't do that, unlike other types of loans. And then finally, the third explanation that we put forward was basically luck. So when you're born and when you're able to make investments really matters. So we've heard this idea that timing is everything, and it's certainly true in terms of wealth accumulation. If you had a house or you had investment in the stock market before the COVID-19 recession, well then, if you were able to hold on to those assets, then it probably really mattered, right? So buying assets when they're cheap versus expensive versus trying to get into the housing market after it boomed, or if you were trying to buy a house right before the Great Recession, when those housing values were inflated. If you made that investment then and then suddenly the housing market crashed, well, that's going to really affect your overall net worth. So the luck of when you're born, the luck of when you're able to make those investments, that matters as well. Okay, in terms of inequalities within student loan debt, so a lot of what I've been talking about has looked at wealth overall. Now I'm going to look at more specifically student loan debt. So this comes from work from a visiting scholar at the Institute, Vanaba Otto, and Xing Zhang, her co-author, and we summarize their work here. So debt was measured when respondents were between the ages of 20 and 35, pretty young, but points in one's career when the steepest earning growth occurs. And overall, a little bit less than half of that sample, 44%, had student loan debt of some kind. And what we see in the bar graph here on the right side is the share of that specific group with student loan debt. And on the left side in the orange, we see the average student debt. And this is not conditional, meaning that it's the entire group. It's not just people that had student debt. What we can see is that, as Linda said in the beginning, women do have more are more likely to have student debt than men, and their balances are higher. And this is true for at least white men, white women, Black men, and Black women. And we also see that the highest likelihood of having student debt is for Black women, and they also have the highest average balances. So their average balance sits at about $11,000. And again, if we were to look at just people who had student loan debt, these balances would be much higher. So these numbers include people that don't have student debt as well. So one of the things that is really concerning about this data is that because of things like the racial wage gap and the gender wage gap, Black Americans, Latino Americans, women, they take longer to pay off not just student loan debt, but other kinds of debt as well, because they don't have as much financial resources as men do and as whites do. And so the fact that Black men and Black women start out with more debt than their white counterparts, they have lower earnings, they pay it down more slowly. So in fact, the gaps in student debt grow over time and the disparities grow over time. So that's pretty concerning, especially as we're thinking about, what I've said earlier, that younger generations tend to have less wealth. Well, if we're compounding that with student debt and we're telling people the way to get ahead is to go to college, and yet because your family doesn't necessarily have a lot of wealth, you have to take out debt to do that, it's kind of this catch-22, right? And then we couple that with the research that I showed you showing that the return is less now for younger generations than it was for older generations. And it's like, well, is it worth it? It might be for some people. And I think the next presenter is going to talk about differences in colleges and in majors. That's data that I don't have access to and haven't done research on, but those are pretty critical decisions to be making as well. Okay, so in terms of paths forward, having a better understanding, I think, of how much debt you'll have and your repayment options, as well as how much your job is going to make you potentially and your earnings opportunities. That's power, right? That's knowledge. And that's something that not a lot of people necessarily have. And I think, especially when we talk about first generation students, and that bar graph that I showed you about educational stickiness, this is part of the reason why that educational stickiness is so pervasive, right? Because families who don't have that information or knowledge, they might be making decisions that are not in their best financial interest. And we didn't talk about it here, but I've done work that shows the difference between families that take out that debt, right? But then don't complete that degree. We haven't even talked about that or addressed that. And that is going to be a group that is really struggling because now they're saddled with this debt, but they don't have the credentials to show for it, to leverage in the job market to get a better paying job and to pay down that debt. Secondly, just basically addressing job and income inequities. So increasing the availability of good jobs that not only pay a living wage, but also give benefits like paid family and medical leave. Black and Latino families and workers are less likely to have jobs that have these kinds of benefits. And they are also more likely to work in occupations that are low wage. So reducing gender and racial gaps can help close the disparities in wealth as well as in student debt. Third, just helping families build wealth. And there's a lot of these, it's just one bullet here, but I wanted to point out there's a lot of innovative solutions that are being thought about right now and being built out. For example, automatically putting a part of your tax refund into a retirement or emergency savings account. A past colleague of mine, Ray Bashara, is now working at Aspen on this idea of 401 kids, which is basically like for a 401k, but at birth or at a very young age, so retirement savings. These kinds of things and these kinds of ideas can start to close some of these demographic gaps. Another idea is sidecar savings accounts, basically an account that is like a 401k matched by your employer, but it can be, you're not penalized for using it for an emergency, right? It's opt-in instead of opt-out. So things like these are options that could be available broadly and conscientiously so that they don't end up making the gaps wider and really instead close them. And I wanted to throw out two final resources for you. So two different Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and of Philadelphia, they have some resources. One is called the Opportunity Occupations Monitor, I believe, and it's basically shows you which jobs in your state are available to workers that don't have a four-year college degree, but they do pay more than the national median wage. So in other words, these are opportunity jobs, right? Opportunity occupations. They pay good money, but you don't necessarily need a college degree to access them. So that's one. And then the other one is the occupational mobility one. This is basically where you're able to see, okay, what kind of job do I have now? And how are those skills transferable to a job that might give me more money, to a higher paying job? So I wanted to throw those two out there because, as I said in the first point, information, knowledge is power, right? So if we have access to these things and we know potentially how we can transfer our skills to better paying jobs, then we can really begin to build up our wealth and reduce our debt. So that's it. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I will pass it back to Linda and Nelson.
Great, Dr. Kent, thank you. And let me turn the presentation over to our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Smith. Dr. Smith, give me a minute to give you control. Wait. I think you should have control. Let me see. Yeah, you have control of the screen. You can should be able to move your slides.
Well, I think I can now. And okay, so I'm going to go back.
Great.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to anyone who's on the East Coast. Thank you so very much, Anna, for that presentation. I think you echo so many of the sentiments we hold at Georgetown that it seems to just be a natural progression to move on to my talk now. So, what's the economic value of college majors? And we've spent so much time, we've spent, a good 20 to 25 minutes talking about student loan debt and why so many people take on debt and the extent to which debt has been a burden to those who've taken it on and how difficult it's been to repay some of that student loan debt. But one of the major reasons people take on debt is to go to school, to go to college, and to earn a college major. So let's talk about why. And we know that there's an increasing role for post-secondary education. Over the past 50 years or so, post-secondary education has taken on a very important role in the United States, with very profound effects for young adults who pursue it. Having a college credential has become more valuable in the labor market. We know it's more expensive and much more of the burden falls directly on students and their families because the public sector is taking a stand back approach in terms of who's going to pay for college. Too many young adults are taking on significant debt, only to be left struggling without the ability to find good jobs. And moreover, the educational gaps between demographic groups represent substantial barriers to economic, racial, and gender justice. So we have these growing gaps that we need to address. On virtually every measure of socioeconomic well-being and status, whether we're talking about personal earnings, share, employed full-time, health status, likelihood of incarceration, job security satisfaction, young college graduates are outperforming their peers with less education. So we know that there's great value to having a college degree. Our concern is how we pay for it and whether or not we are making the best decisions regarding which types of degrees we pursue. The median earnings rise with each additional level of education. So this is something we've sort of talked about with the last presenter. If you look at what your lifetime earnings could potentially be If you're a high school dropout or you have less than a high school diploma, it's 1.2 million over your lifetime on average. And that goes up with each additional attainment level. So 1.6 million for high school diplomas, GEDs, 1.9 for those with some college no degree, 2 million for associate's degree, 2.8 million for a BA. So a lot of the conversation often focuses on the disparities between holders of a bachelor's degree and those with a high school diploma, because you can earn potentially $1.2 million more on average if you have a BA compared to those who only complete a high school diploma. With a master's degree, it goes up to 3.2 million, doctoral 4, and professional degrees 4.7 million. But even when we speak about those substantial differences, there are variations in earnings within education levels. And that means that some workers with less education can earn more than other workers with more education. So if you look at this particular chart, there's a lot of overlap here. And you can find, for example, some people with a high school diploma can earn more than the lower end of the some college, associates, or even a bachelor's degree. You'd find that some people with a bachelor's degree can earn more than some masters and some doctoral degrees. So we need to ask ourselves which ones, by whom, and which locations, which geographies are doing better with these degrees. 16% of high school diploma holders and 28% of AA holders earn more than half of the workers with a bachelor's degree. So we know that there's something going on within our degrees that can make some high school diplomas and some associate's degree still earn more on average than our bachelor's degrees holders. Men have higher earnings, lifetime earnings, than women at every corresponding level of education, but women's and men's earnings still overlap significantly. And I love talking about this particular chart because there's a conversation about the gender wage gap that's also a conversation about personal choice. Sometimes we observe that there are differences between what men and women earn, but a lot of those differences are still coming from gender differences and occupational segregation in what people choose for their occupations. We find that women are still predominantly engaged in the professions such as teaching and nursing. So we tend to call those the intellectual and caring professions. And men are still disproportionately involved in business and some engineering and STEM fields. So that occupational segregation is also one of the reasons that we observe differences in the wages between men and women. It's not the only reason. And we even observe within particular similar occupations that men can earn more. And one of the most interesting things for me as an example was looking at the nursing field, where the nursing field is predominantly female, yet the men who are engaged in nursing still tend to earn more on average. And part of that reason had to do with the type of nursing they were engaged in. Psychiatric nursing, as an example, was paying more than pediatric nursing, and men were disproportionately involved in psychiatric nursing than pediatric nursing. But even within some occupations, you find that men will still earn more than women. So we know that one of the conversations we should have is on return on investments. And one of the reports we've worked on at the center shows that colleges with high shares of STEM majors have higher median returns on investment than colleges with high shares of students majoring in the arts. So the way our community and the way our society is structured, we place a lot of emphasis on the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics professions. We tend to favor those professions more, and we tend to reward those professions with higher wages, much more so than those who pursue majors in the arts or the social sciences. And these particular charts demonstrate that when it comes to, the bottom third, majoring in arts or majoring in business, the likelihood of having a higher ROI is always associated with those who have a higher percentage of students majoring in the STEM fields. As an example, University of Texas system-wide graduates who majored in architecture, and engineering have the highest earnings, a finding which is also reflected in all US graduates. So if you look at this particular chart, the blue line represents the United States, and architecture and engineering earnings are always above those of everyone else. It's followed by computer science and health. So we sort of have an emphasis here on the STEM majors, and business also follows closely behind. So there is a hierarchy here with a preference for STEM majors in terms of the earnings potential, and those in the lower end of the distribution tend to be in the arts, and there's some philosophy majors there. So those are the ones that tend to earn lower wages. When we first started this conversation and Linda was introducing us and talking about particular majors, she gave an example of psychology, she gave an example of social work, and those are majors that are highly valued and very much needed in our society, yet we tend to pay them less than any of the other professions with similar levels of education and similar years of training. So this particular chart just sort of emphasizes that. So gender matters in America. So amongst all of these conversations we have about education matters, gender also matters in how much you would earn. And here's a chart that shows that while women have made significant strides in pursuing traditionally male-dominated majors, many major choices remain segregated. So we have an example here of the distribution between 1970 and 2016 in different majors. And you look at healthcare, we can look at education, we look at psychology, communication, business, physical sciences, and engineering. We still have, even though there's been strides in engineering as an example, we still only have 17% of women in engineering fields in 2016. Even though it's improved substantially since 1970. So we still have significant amount of segregation in the majors and the major choices that people make, and these major choices, of course, play themselves out in the labor market. In high-paying occupational fields, women are more concentrated in lower-paying occupations. So we have an example of CEOs, percentage to women, lawyers, physicians and surgeons, registered nurses, paralegals, market research analysts as an example. And we spoke about the fact that even though 89% of registered nurses are women, that the 11% of men on average still earn more because of the subdivisions of the fields that they work in, but they still earn more than some of these women. Race matters. So we have some examples here of college enrollment, and we have college enrollment by race ethnicity, and 64% of the college enrollment age in 2020 of people who are eligible to go 64% of Asians go, 41% of eligible whites, 36% of eligible blacks, two or more races, 36%. So we still have huge disparities by race in college admissions and who goes to college. I seem to have, oh, here we go. So not only does race matter in college admission, it also matters in college completion. And this is something we spoke about as well in the past. Here are the 6-year outcomes. And if you look at overall Asian, Black, Hispanic, white, you find that some of the highest percentage of people who are not enrolled are still Black and Hispanics. And the highest percentage of people who completed at the start of an institution are Asian and white. So we still have these huge disparities in not only who's attending, but who's completing college. And we talk about completion. Completion matters because, there's nothing worse than going to college and not completing. Because not only are you still saddled with the debt that you took on to go to college, but now you can't even get the job that allows you to pay for the debt that you took out. So we focus on completion as well, just to demonstrate that there's a lot of people who are going to college and not completing, taking on this additional debt and ending up much worse off than if they had not gone at all. Race matters in terms of the size of student loan debt. And this is something you saw with the previous speaker, where substantial amounts of debt is held by Hispanic and Black and African American students. And I think if you look to the right of this chart, where the dark gray to the right represents people who owe more than 60,000, you find that Black and African Americans, 17% of them owe more than 60,000, the highest percentage of a group that owes that much money in student loan debt, and followed closely by multiracial groups and Hispanic Latinos and American Indian and Alaskan Natives. So there's still huge disparities in what is owed, most of that having to do with how much you actually take out in debt and how quickly debt is repaid. Class matters too, but race and class are not the same. And, so we talked about the divide by gender, we talk about the divide by race. Now we're talking about the divide by class. Racial disadvantage and class disadvantage often overlap. But when you combine race with class, that's when you have the strongest impact. And some colleges should strive for class diversity along with racial diversity when we talk about diversity. So some of these class disadvantages and racial disadvantages are distinct problems and require distinctive solutions. And I'm sort of raising this because very often when we talk about racial equity, you get the pushback that there's so many, poor, disadvantaged whites in this country that we need to make sure we include everyone in the conversation. So this is just a reminder that class and race are different, and the disadvantages of one observes because of one's socioeconomic status can be very different than the advantages observed because of one's race and ethnicity. Race and educational attainment are correlated. So we know that we still have huge disparities between race and attainment. And in this particular chart, if you look only at the light blue at the bottom, it's the percentage of each racial ethnic group that has a high school or less, and you find that Hispanic Latinos are the highest percentage there with a high school or less. So this just demonstrates how difficult it's been for certain groups to attain a college degree, even after all of these strides we've made with increasing enrollment. Educational attainment and income levels are also correlated. So we know that one's education is highly correlated with income, and this is why we constantly have these conversations about attainment and income. And I wanted to move forward to the slides that talk about what we can possibly do. Comprehensive reforms. So there's 7 suggestions. Embrace diversity and invest in culturally responsive teaching and counseling. So we need to have a lot more counseling, which tells people about what's there, what's available to them, and where they should be going. Apply an equity lens to all policy and programmatic reforms by measuring inequality and crafting policies and programs designed to address it. So we have to measure it, we have to address it, we have to know what's there. We have to provide targeted wraparound supports, educational and social supports, to people from cradle to career. So we're not necessarily only talking about when you're in college to find support. So we're talking about pre-K, kindergarten, all the way up until college. We have to invest in programs that treat education and labor markets as a single system and recognize that from early childhood to the first good job, we need strong employer involvement. So this is, again, advocating for from the cradle to the labor market, making sure that everyone has access to a good job and defining what that good job is. And we're going to move on to helping young people, especially those that are marginalized by the education system, to pursue and attain their education and career goals, using career exposure and work-based learning. So making sure that people have access to good internships that are preparing them for the world of work. We must have a transparent, data-based education and career navigation system that is accountable for making outcomes more effective and equitable. And finally, we know we have to make college more affordable and more convenient. We have to invest in free college. And this was a conversation that took place in the last election, but we have to continue talking about free college. Incremental credentialing, which we heard the last speaker talk about, and community college BA programs and transfer pathways. So once again, thank you for your time. And I'm going to move on to our 3rd and 4th speakers.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Smith. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go back 2 slides really quickly. I think there we go. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Kat Welbeck, Advocacy Director at the Student Borrower Protection Center, and I'm joined by my colleague, Amy, who will also introduce herself when she gets to her part of the presentation. But I just want to start by, oops, the slides are moving. Thank you. Amy will introduce herself when she gets to her part of the presentation, but I just first want to thank Consumer Action so much for the opportunity to join today, and also just really excited to be able to present with both Drs. Kent and Dr. Smith. To start, just a little bit of background to also talk a little bit about the framing of how Amy and I are going to talk about the student debt crisis and current programs aimed at addressing it. Is that so the SBPC, we're a nonprofit organization. We're solely focused on alleviating the burden of student debt. So we do that through a mix of things, including advocacy, litigation, and policy making. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about a background on student debt, how we frame these issues, but also some of the advocacy that we've been doing and some of the changes that we've seen in the student loan system. And one thing that's just really important and really helpful, and glad we're following along from Dr. Kent and Dr. Smith in talking about these issues, is that really hearing both of them talk about the significance of wealth disparities, and also the importance of higher ed. So we know that there are these deeply entrenched wealth disparities within the student debt crisis, but also that does not negate the importance of higher ed. And so we're going to talk about why we advocate for policy change, because we see these disparities, but we also need to talk about the importance of having broad, equitable, and affordable access to higher education. And so one thing we talk about this is really just how important it is not to overlook the long-standing effects of discriminatory economic policy in this country, and how the student debt crisis is deeply a reflection of, and it really continues to perpetuate systemic barriers in racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination, and many other ways that people are marginalized in our communities. And so when we're talking about addressing the student debt crisis, it's really hitting at the core of how do we create policy solutions that really advance equity. And so on this first slide, we'll see, and I don't have access to my slides. Okay, there we go. So something that we saw that Dr. Kent talked about is that also we've seen explosive growth of student debt over the past decade and a half. And one thing that we talk about in terms of the student debt crisis is, why do we see such significant growth? What we saw at the end of the Great Recession is really seeing the dual effects of wealth loss during the Great Recession, and then also with that loss of wealth, we also saw less public and state investment in higher education. And so what was previously a public investment in providing a greater public investment in providing higher education to students wanting to pursue higher education, we actually saw that burden really shifting to families. And so thinking about the ways that asking families to shoulder the cost of higher education rather than having a greater public investment in higher education. And so specifically, what does that mean when we're saying we're asking for families to fund, their children's higher education, especially for students from low wealth families? And that will come in the form of debt, because when we're talking about, we heard about wealth disparities earlier, if your family does not have the money to pay for college, that expense comes in the form of debt. And so, as we'll talk about a little bit later, that really significantly affects Black and Latino students. We're talking about a racial wealth gap and who has access to higher education. And so with these higher levels of debt that we see, is that we also see that what's significant about not only seeing higher levels of debt over the past 15 plus years is that this is a really huge problem. We're thinking about how many more people are taking on debt to access higher education, because it really has day-to-day effects on people's opportunities to build wealth over their lifetime. So we see that student loan borrowers, student debt inhibits their ability to buy homes, to start small businesses, to save for retirement, or even, we hear a lot really frequently, even student loan borrowers' ability to save for day-to-day expenses, to be able to have an emergency savings account. And so what we see is that student debt is cutting into people's ability to accumulate wealth over their lifetimes. And again, if we're talking about the fact that at its core, student debt is about who has wealth and who has access to wealth, because whether or not you take on debt depends on whether or not your family is able to contribute to your college education, or you're able to have access to money to pay for your education. So what we really see is that we're perpetuating wealth disparities with student debt. And particularly for Black and Latino student loan borrowers, in our next slide, is what we see is that we see higher levels of debt borrowing across. I'm sorry, I still don't have access to my slides. There we go, thanks. And what we see is that Black students are more likely to take on debt. And then, so what we see is that when we're talking about household wealth, if we have a racial wealth gap in our country, where Black and Latino students have less wealth than their white peers, what ends up happening is when you have less household wealth, you're more likely to borrow if you do go to school. And so we see, especially for Black borrowers, that's in significantly higher amounts. And so when we see students graduate with more student loan debt, and as noted earlier, Black women have the highest balances on average. And again, that's even more magnified when we talk about pay disparities. As just discussed, that really cuts into ability to build wealth over a lifetime, as we see in the next slide. And so really, the student debt crisis at its core is a civil rights crisis. And on the next slide, and just in talking about these conversations about, we're talking about these wealth disparities, but at the top of this webinar, the question was a lot about, is a college degree worth it? And what we do know is that we tell students, you know, the best way to seek economic opportunity is to go to school, get an education, improve your chances for being able to get a good paying job. And one thing that we really want to note in what we do in terms of our advocacy at the Student Borrower Protection Center is really talking about, again, the value and the importance of education, and just being able to say who has access to educational opportunity. Because what we do is know is that we still want people to be able to access higher education regardless of their wealth. So when we talk about questions about even is a degree worth it, it's talking about who are we asking that question to? If we're asking a question about people, is your degree worth it? And it's very much so hinged on the discussion of whether or not you'll have a lifetime of debt to pay that off. I think part of it is we're asking the wrong questions. We should be asking questions about how we actually fund education, how we're providing greater access to education in our country, and making sure that it's equitable and broadly accessible. And so, again, really appreciated Dr. Smith at the end of her presentation for talking about the importance of free college, because when we get into later the presentation, Amy's going to talk some more about recent changes to the student loan system, but it's really important to note that a lot of the conversations and advocacy about debt cancellation is really talking about fixing, one, longstanding issues with our debt finance higher education system, two, fixing significant programmatic issues that we've seen over the past couple of decades in the student loan system that Amy's going to talk about. But then two, creating a pathway to think about how do we move past a debt finance higher education system and realize that higher education is a public good, and making sure that we're investing in future generations. And so just a couple of really quick things on the next slide before we go into some of these programmatic changes. Linda exits to highlight also a couple of other things, and just really wanted to point out that we're talking a lot about wealth disparities, but we also want to talk about the ways that we also see predatory behavior in the student loan space, where we also see bad actors engaging in wealth extracting behaviors that target communities of color. So for example, many people are familiar with for-profit colleges that have with issues of for-profit colleges that frequently come to light, where these schools offer programs that are of questionable value, but are often financed by expensive private financing, private loans. So in addition to getting access to federal funds, a lot of times these schools also offer students expensive private products that come with significantly fewer consumer protections as federal student loans. And again, because of many of the deceptive practices in terms of advertising, offerings of schools, students often leave with degrees that are not able to also to provide them the gainful employment that would demand higher wages. And so some of you may have heard about, for example, the recent class action case, Sweet versus Cardona, where there are nearly 200,000 student loan borrowers who were misled by their schools were actually able to receive relief through the borrower defense program. And Amy's going to talk a little bit about some of those programmatic changes. And then just really quickly on the next slide, also just talking briefly about this idea of predatory inclusion, is thinking about the ways that there are certain private student loan products that are also, again, used to prop up schools and educational programs that are of questionable value. And so what we see is, for example, buy now, pay later. So this rise of risky loan products that often come with hidden fees, a lack of consumer protections, but are advertised as a way for students who who come from generally from low income, low wealth backgrounds, their ability to be able to access either higher education or training programs. But really oftentimes we see these financial instruments used as ways to target and recruit students into predatory educational programs. We've also seen similar things with income share agreements at for-profit schools, coding boot camps, other forms of upskilling type programs. And then just generally really quickly, one other thing we were going to just briefly highlight was just some of our research about student debt broadly across the South on the next slide. And so one thing that we also do at the Student Borrower Protection Center is use research to tell the story of student loan borrowers across this country. And so one thing that we've done is looked at research exploring the geography of student debt, particularly in the South, the first of that series being in Atlanta, and looking at how to tell the national story of student debt through a more granular geographic lens. And so when we're talking about stories about Black student loan borrowers, particularly their struggles in repayment, the struggles of student loan debt, one thing that we did a report highlighting these effects specifically in Atlanta, looking at the phenomenon of one, greater borrowing across the city, what we see across the whole in terms of following national trends of larger student loan borrowing in the past 15 years. But two, on the next slide, you'll see is specifically looking at the significant struggles that Black student loan borrowers face with that. So in addition to seeing rising student loan borrowing across the board, seeing larger balances in majority Black neighborhoods, but then also looking at struggles in repayment. So seeing that there are a greater share of Black student loan borrowers with non-declining balances. And so Amy's going to talk a little bit about some of the broken issues with student loan programs, but oftentimes we see many students with non-declining balances because of the way that our current income-driven repayment system is set up. So student loan borrowers could be making payments every single month, but because they're only making payments on their interest, they actually never see their balances declining. And so we tell this larger story about student debt being wealth extracting. Part of this report was really telling the story about how, we can tell people to get an education. It's a pathway to economic mobility, but looking at the ways that our broken student loan system really further entrenches existing wealth disparities, even when student loan borrowers seek greater economic mobility through higher education. And so I know we're a little bit short on time. So one thing that we do want to do is make sure Amy has time to talk a little bit about these student loan programs that previously have been deeply broken, and talking about some of the changes that we've seen through this administration, but really just highlighting the importance of the multifaceted fixes for student loan debt. One, acknowledging that student loan debt is a result of and deeply perpetuates wealth disparities in this country. But then two, talking about the ways that systemic failures within the larger student loan program have exacerbated these struggles. And then three, talking about the ways that a pathway forward through debt cancellation and thinking about free college and other ways to move past a debt finance higher education system is a step towards achieving greater equity. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks everyone for having me today. My name's Amy Czulada. I'm from the Student Borrower Protection Center as well. If we could go to the next slide, we wanted to leave you with some good news today. And so I'm sure many of you may have heard of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which is essentially a program where if you work in the public service for 10 years, you can get your debt forgiven. There were a lot of historical issues with the program. People were being denied because they had the wrong loan type, or they didn't have the right repayment plan that they were in. And so 99% of folks were rejected, during the first 12 years or so of the program. But in 2021, the Department of Education announced a special waiver that would help people get retroactive credit for PSLF. So they, may have been previously denied and then could get this retroactive credit towards PSLF cancellation. And so this was huge. it recently came out that's since this waiver period and in the past few months, billions of dollars of student loans have been forgiven through PSLF, and so this was really meaningful for folks, and many benefits. Oh, sorry, I think there's a little feedback. Many of the benefits of the waiver are still currently in place, and so if you could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that. There's something called income-driven repayment. Basically, it's a way for folks to have a more affordable payment each month. And after 20 or 25 years in the program, depending on what type of loans you have, you're supposed to have your debt forgiven entirely. However, a Government Accountability Office report came out last year that only, fewer than 200 people have gotten cancellation through income-driven repayment plans. And there's potentially like 4.4 million borrowers who could be eligible for this. And so to rectify this, the Department of Education has announced this one-time adjustment of all federal, loan accounts. And so basically they're going to go through and they're going to do an audit of everyone's federal account and see how close you are towards that, threshold of 20 or 25 years to cancellation. And so they're going to count all time in repayment. They're going to count some periods of forbearance and deferment. And the nice thing is that all this counts towards PSLF credit. So this is kind of how, the waiver is essentially extended, and folks can get PSLF credit through this IDR account adjustment. And so this is going to be really life-changing for a lot of folks. One thing to consider is that if you don't have federal loans that are currently held by the Department of Education, you'll need to consolidate. So if you have those commercial fill loans, or if you have Perkins loans that aren't held by the department, you'll need to consolidate by the end of the year in order to take advantage of this program right now. And if you are seeking PSLF through this and want to get retroactive credit this way, and you don't have direct loans, you'll also need to consolidate before the end of the year and then get your PSLF forms sent. There's more information about this on our website, cancelmystudentdebt.org. But I do want just a couple minutes to get through the next couple of programs as well. So if you could go to the next, oh, perfect, thank you. So also happening this year is an initiative called Fresh Start. And essentially, it's a way for borrowers to get out of default if they've been in default. It could potentially get 7 million people out of default. And it'll immediately restore your ability to go back to school and be eligible for Title IV funds. And then it also restores your one-time rehabilitation option if you've been in default. And then it'll restore your credit as well. So one thing to consider here is that this also isn't completely automatic. You basically have a year after the payment pause ends to either request Title IV aid or request that your guarantee agency put you on a payment plan again in order to take part in Fresh Start. But it's really going to be a lifeline for those borrowers who have been in default for a long time. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide. And then I'm sure top of mind is that President Biden's debt relief plan is currently held up in the Supreme Court, but it could be really valuable for folks. An estimated 40 million people could receive cancellation, with 20 million people seeing their debt wiped out completely. And so we are eagerly awaiting the Supreme Court decision because we know that the benefits of this will be, absolutely astounding for folks. And so, yeah, I think next slide, please, if you don't mind. Just want to be mindful that people probably have a lot of questions as well. Okay, the last thing to consider is just that, repayment is set to go back into effect either 60 days after June 30th or 60 days after we receive a SCOTUS decision. And so, we're really looking at likely the end of August, early September, and folks should get a statement 21 days before their first payment is due. Another thing to consider is that if you were on auto-debited payments before the payment pause began, those will restart with the same amount that they were before. So if you think that you'll have trouble, making those payments, it's good to request that you get off of those auto-debited payments and do that 3 business days before the start of payments are set to resume. So happy to answer more questions about these programs, but just wanted to give you some highlights from this year that are going on currently. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy and Kat. And let me apologize. My computer is frozen, so I couldn't give you control of your slides. And I'm calling in because I'm muted on my computer. So thank you very much. Special thanks to all of the speakers. Please join me in sending them some love for those great, informative presentations. Nelson, do you have a ton of questions for our speakers?
Yes, Linda, we do have some questions for speakers. Somebody is asking, we'll jump right into it. And of course, any of the speakers can answer, and they can supplement each other's answers as much as they want, or ask each other questions as well. First question is, in the earlier part of the webinar, somebody asked, where does a trade school education fall in the economic continuum? We have a dearth of trained trades people because we have been pushing college bound as the only alternative to wealth. So we've been pushing college as the alternative to wealth, but where does a trade school education fall into this continuum?
One thing I'd like to know, I'm sure other panelists have.
And let us know who's speaking when you talk, please.
Oh, sorry. Hi, this is Kat. One thing I also want to chime in too is that also people who go to trade school and go to trade schools also have student debt, and so that's another thing I want to point out. And so again, I think those are very important professions. It's important for people. I think that the important thing, it's important for people to have access to pathways. So whether someone wants to go to trade school, whether they want to go to college, it's about making sure that we have affordable pathways for people to achieve those opportunities and to pursue those dreams and their interests. But also just wanted to note the fact that there are many people in the trades who also have student loan debt. And so when we're talking about these student loan issues, it's also important to think about them, because sometimes people have certain ideas or views of who a student loan borrower is. But again, 45 million people in this country, so it really is a really broad swath of our communities.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on trade schools? Okay, let me move on to the next question. And I believe Kat and Amy, this relates to your first slide where you talked about the growth of US student loan debt has been consistent and explosive. It says more than 1.75 trillion in outstanding student debt and an increase in 561%. Do you offhand have what was the date range for these stats? I don't know if you have that on hand. It wasn't in the slide. And if it's something that you can get us later, that's fine too.
I'll give it to you later. I believe it may not be on this. It may have been cut off from the slide, but let me see if I can find that for you. But we can send that out.
Okay, great. And we can move on. And if you find it, we can tell us a little later. And then the discussion about free college. Somebody's asking, how do you place value on something if it is free? Is that part of the debate, or what have you heard around that?
This is Kat, but before I chime in, I don't want to take up all of the air. So one of our other panelists wants to chime in.
Feel free to go ahead, Kat, and maybe others will chime in after you.
One thing I think is really important is talking about how we frame these issues. And I think part of this conversation about making higher education more affordable is really changing our idea and our narrative about access to higher education. One, we as a country, we did previously invest more in higher education. Two, public school is free in this country in many places. K through 12 is free, but also in many places, have access to pre-K3, pre-K4 for free. So I think it's about just changing our mindset about, do we believe higher education is a public good, and being willing to make those investments so we're not saddling people with lifetimes of debt. So I think it's just one of those things about how we shift our understanding of higher education and our government's role in saying that we think it's important for people to have opportunities, access to higher education, and being willing to make those investments.
Can I just sort of relate it, and we can continue the discussion a little more? Another person asked, who will be paying the professors and the universities if education is free? So who's going to cut those checks?
I will follow up because I answer this. I think that's one important question is, as a country, and thinking about what we value, we pay for the things that we value, right? And I think there are many ways. Again, I do not claim to be someone who does like the budget, but I think I think it's more so about our value sets as a country, because right now we are paying for it, right? We are paying for it in a myriad of ways for the fact that we have an explosive student debt crisis that not only has a daily impact on people's budget sheets, but it affects our communities as a whole that we live in. And so, again, we talk about shifting this narrative and then even shifting the way that we think about paying for higher education. Our debt finance higher education system has a cost, and we see that every day with 45 million people who have $1.7 trillion of student loan debt. We see that with the 8 million people who are in default before the student loan payment pause. So I also think it's really important when we talk about this narrative that we also think about those costs as well, and we invest in the things that we care about.
Thank you, Kat. And somewhat related question, and maybe Dr. Smith, you might have a little bit of an insight, even though it may be out of your department, but what about the increasing cost of college? Is with inflation the way it is now, is the cost of college expected to go up? Are there any forces trying to control that a little bit? Any thoughts on that?
From the research that we're doing and the work that we see, there's nothing that I think is indicating that there's going to be any decline in the cost of college. College is going up and continues to go up. I think what we're seeing is the number of schools are being consolidated, because there are many schools that are actually closing down because they're no longer able to attract the type of students or attract the number of students that they need in order to survive. So we have declining student enrollment as a concern. We have declining interest in college as a concern. And maybe that is going to push the discussion a little bit towards the cost of college. But as of now, we still have, cost rising much faster than inflation.
Okay, thank you. And that was Dr. Smith, right? Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Yes, that was me. Thank you.
Also, in one of a question of the specific one of the slides that talked about only 157 of 4.4 million borrowers received cancellation via income debt repayment plan. Somebody was asking if there was a source for that information, or where they can research that kind of information.
Yeah, sure. I can send along information about that. I believe it's directly from the Department of Education, so I can send that along.
Okay, great. Someone's asking, has there been any guidance on how the COVID payment pause will affect a PSLF? If no payments were made due to not being required, will those months count toward the 120 payments if the borrower worked in PS during the payment pause?
Yes, we love this question. The good news is that all those months of the payment pause, so essentially 3 years of payments, count towards PSLF credit, as long as you've been working for a nonprofit or a government, an eligible employer during that time. And of course, you have to submit your PSLF forms in order to kind of raise your hand and let the Department of Education know that you're interested in PSLF. But yes, the great news is that those 3 years will count towards PSLF.
Yeah, here's not a complete question, but it has to do, it seems to be they're looking for information on whether interest rates on loans will be lowered. Will there be lowering of interest rates on these loans?
Well, this is set by Congress, so I don't know that we can predict which way interest rates will go. Yeah, I don't know that anyone has a crystal ball to answer that question, but they are set by Congress.
Okay. It's a question with the fresh start option that restores credit. Does this take the late payments off, like the rehabilitation, or just starts with on-time payments once the fresh start is initiated?
I believe it takes the late payments off, but I can follow up with more information about Fresh Start in particular.
Excellent. Yeah, anything you send us this afternoon, we can try to get everybody tomorrow, actually. Do student loans roll off, and I guess this is off credit reports or something, off after 15 years?
I believe it's like any other financial product, and it would be after 7 years. I'm as far as I know, it works, you know, the way that other financial products do.
Okay, great. A question for Dr. Kent, and I don't know if you have your deck of slides in front of you regarding a minus 22 on slide 18. I can quickly try to get to that. It was the educational wealth gaps. It says in 2019, four-year college graduates, 39% of households, 22% 4 years, 16% post-grad. Was that a minus 22 or well, maybe that was just a bullet?
Yeah, it's just a bullet point. So that's so 39% of households had a 4-year college graduate respondent, and so 22% were 4-year grads and 16% were postgrads of the overall pop.
Thank you, Dr. Kent. And then people will be getting a PDF version of these slides tomorrow so they can take a closer look. Next question. The last presenter mentioned income share as being one of the predatory practices used by for-profit schools. Is that comparable to work study? If not, what is income sharing?
So one thing to know, some for-profit schools might use income share agreements, also some traditional non-for-profit colleges and universities use them, some training programs and boot camps use them, but an income share agreement is essentially a type of loan where someone provides a portion of their future income. They promise a portion of their future income for financing for their education now. And so, but oftentimes these loans come with fewer consumer protections that other type of consumer products that might have. And then also just in terms of like their risk and students understanding of their programs, they can be predatory in that sense. But no, that's different than work study. Work study is where, for example, a university provides a student with a job. These are, we're talking about income share agreements. Those are just actual types of loans that people use to finance a portion of their higher education. So for example, if someone meets the cap on their federal student loan cap 1 year, but they need extra money to pay for their living expenses, they can, for example, get an income share agreement to offset some of those costs, but those might be much costlier loans. They often lack many of the protections of federal student loans, or for example, some training boot camps or other kind of questionable training programs might use income share agreements for people to fund those educations, but then those programs might be of questionable value. So people are then saddled with a form of private debt that lacks, again, many of the protections that come alongside federal student loans. That when Amy was outlining those programs, a lot of those are protections that are solely available through federal student loans. And so when students end up struggling with repayment, there could just be pretty significant consequences, but very different than work study.
Thanks so much, Kat. And then someone seeking a clarification here. It says student borrowers have to the end of the year to consolidate their student loans, FFEL and Perkins, to start counting all the months of payments and possibly even the forbearance or deferred payments. The person with the question says, I thought that the deadline was the end of October 2022, but you are stating it's the end of this year, 2023. Just clarify that I heard this correctly. Just clarifying whether I heard this correctly.
Yeah, this is a great question. So the PSLF waiver was in effect from October of 2021 till October of 2022. However, a lot of the benefits of the waiver kind of live on through this thing called the IDR account adjustment that I explained. And so through the IDR account adjustment, people can essentially get that PSLF credit in a similar way that the waiver worked. But through the IDR account adjustment, you need to consolidate by December 31st of 2023. So it is different than the waiver, but there are many of the benefits that still live on through this new program. People could see their accounts adjusted as soon as this year or next year, depending on how long you've been in repayment. And so consolidating before the end of the year has a lot of benefits to it.
Okay, thanks so much. Little bit of a clarification question. During the COVID payment pause, is the government paying interest during this time, or is the borrower responsible?
There is no interest on student loans during the payment pause. So yeah, there's no interest accruing at all during the payment pause.
Great. And then a little bit more maybe on the income sharing. Income share sounds like tuition reimbursement policies at some organizations. They pay, but you have to pay back if you don't stay for a certain period of time post completion. Is that a fair comparison?
No, but someone did raise another type of we call them traps for like the fact that they're training repayment provisions that keep people often trapped in their jobs, but another form of predatory action. So we do have some work on that, talking about training repayment agreements where oftentimes people are forced to stay in their jobs or else pay really exorbitant amounts to be able to leave. So that's different, but that is something that we've also worked on.
Great, thank you. And then I think I'll wrap it up with this. This is really maybe around financial education. Somebody's commenting that financial aid offices should review with students what their payments will be before they actually purchase the education, take on these loans. Is there a lack of education going on? Can financial aid offices do more?
Hi, this is Kat again. Oftentimes schools will do some sort of financial aid exit counseling, but one thing that's difficult, it's very difficult to one, if you're a student who comes from a low wealth household and your only opportunity to pursue an education is to take out loans, even with the education, it's talking about, real life decisions, it's really difficult to tell a student either you can go to school or take on that debt. So that's one, a difficult decision to say. Are we just saying that that's part of the problem, right? Is that we tell people the only way to be able to access education is to have this debt. And then two, and this is part of the reason why Amy's talking about these programs, because we do have this debt, we have these programs that were created to be able to offset some of the costs and some of the struggles that we see with people in student debt repayment. But the problem is they haven't worked. So someone could have gone to financial aid counseling as they exited college and said, I'm going to be a teacher, I can do PSLF. Or someone could say, I'm going to get on an income-driven repayment plan and my debt's going to get canceled after 10 years. But what we've seen in reality is that when only, 100 plus people had gotten cancellation through IDR prior to this administration, or we saw that, for nearly, when we saw since, the creation of the public service loan forgiveness program, people were continually denied and turned away because of administrative errors. Even if people were receiving that education, there was no way for them to fix a broken student loan system. So it's also really important to note, yes, we can tell borrowers about their programs. We advocate, again, like Amy was saying, talking about people's different pathways to debt relief, because it's really important for people to know them, to be educated about those opportunities. But it's also, we have to acknowledge that, one, are we saying that people should not have the opportunity for higher education if they come from low wealth households? Because right now we finance education through student loan debt. And then two, are we saying, what do we do with student loan borrowers who try to do everything right? That teacher who worked in a school for 20 years and wasn't told that they had access to public service loan forgiveness. So there are ways that we can educate people, but you also can't educate people out of how do you access a system that is built around who has access to wealth and deeply hinged on, inequality in this country. And then two, how can you educate people around, misconduct from the people who are supposed to be educating and helping people navigate this deeply complex student loan system?
Great, thank you. If I could just slip in this, does student loan forgiveness apply to parent loans?
So if you're seeking, PSLF, or if you're seeking, cancellation through the income-driven repayment, the IDR account adjustment, Parent Plus loans are included in that. I would encourage you to check out some of our resources on our website, cancelmystudentdebt.org, or we have some webinars that are previously recorded that will kind of go into more detail on Parent Plus loans, but yes, they are eligible.
Okay, great. Sorry, this will be the last question. For somebody who's already paid off their loans or just recently paid off their loans, is there any kind of anything for them in terms of, I don't know, any refunds or I guess only if there was a problem in school, I would imagine. I don't know if you've heard anything about that.
So one thing to note is that if you've made any voluntary payments during the pandemic, so during the payment pause, you can request refunds for those payments. If you recently, paid off your debt, I don't think there's any way to get most of that back in most cases, but yeah, there are ways to kind of request a refund for payments that were made during the payment pause, which, is really helpful for folks, especially if you're seeking PSLF.
Great. Thank you so much. We are going to have a part 2, so we can definitely handle more questions next time. I'll turn it back over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Nelson, and a special thanks to all our guest speakers. Amy, am I correct to say that if we made payments through the pause, we can ask for a refund?
That's correct. You just have to call your servicer and request them. And also, if you are requesting a refund, refunds can only be made to the borrower themselves. But if your employer made payments on your behalf, you can also request a refund for those payments, and they'll be paid to you. And so, yeah, you just call your servicer and ask for a refund.
Well, thank you for that information. And if you could send us the link to some of your online resources, we will share it with the audience. Special thanks to our guest speakers for hanging in there and answering all of those questions. I want to thank our sponsor again. A special shout out to Wells Fargo for giving us the funds to have this webinar. If you would like to contribute to consumer action, you can do so online by credit card or PayPal by going to www.consumer-action.org/giving. Or you can mail us a check to Consumer Action, attention membership given, 57 Post Street, 6111, San Francisco, California, 94104. Don't have a check? No worries. You can still support us. You can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. It's free, and it would help us continue to bring you these great webinars. Speaking of great webinars, you can register today for part 2 of our 2-part series on student loans. It's scheduled for May 31st. We have a great lineup of speakers. It's going to be a blast. If you have any questions regarding the webinar, send me an email and I will get you that answer. Again, a special thanks to our guest speakers for those excellent presentations. I can't wait to hear what you think about today's webinar. So please remember to complete the survey. We value your feedback as we strive to bring you timely, relevant information. It's going to make a difference in the lives of the consumers and the communities that you serve. Before I go, please let me leave you with this one thing. As Dr. Kent stated during her presentation, knowledge is power, but knowledge is much more powerful when it's shared. Think about it. When only one person knows something and that knowledge is not shared, it prevents others from developing it. It hinders our communities and it keeps our communities from growing. On the other hand, society benefits from an informed consumer. Am I right? So please, find a way to share the knowledge you've learned today with someone. When you receive the PowerPoint slides used today, share them with a coworker or an advocate in your network. Share the link to the YouTube video. Play the video for a group of clients, for your church members, PTA, or your child's sports team. You know, some seniors getting ready to head for college. Play it for them so they will understand what they're getting into when they sign up for student loan debt. I challenge you to find 3 people, and share this powerful information that you learned today with them. This is all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us and for submitting your questions. A link to today's recording will be released soon, so watch your inbox. Hope to see you on May 31st for part 2 of our series on student loans. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your service. Thanks again to our great guest speakers. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter or Facebook. Have a great rest of your day.